leave behind to my future generation information about their past, for them to know that there were generations before them that didn't have the benefit they are experiencing today. Whether today is 2024 or 2074. So much of my family's personal past are bookmarked by the history of this country. Any mention of my family's history is incomplete without highlighting my grandfather, Ambrose Cross, who was known as a pillar of old Ellicott City. I'll highlight him at the end of this talk. For me, he represents someone who overcame the 180 years or more of slavery and discrimination to be noted as an institution in his community. His wealth was not measured in monetary or material value, but his kindness, thoughtfulness, and the lives he touched through his life journey. For someone like myself who has traveled extensively over the early years of my life, I felt like I had a somewhat nomadic existence, metaphorically speaking, roaming about from place to place. But it has inspired a passion, a journey in me to better know and cherish my roots. I don't think my family's journey is any more special than any of us here today. In fact, I would encourage each of you, I suspect you are, to record those things that make you who you are, including your life lessons and history. I started a book some years ago to leave something behind to my kids and grandkids about their past that I haven't yet completed. Some of my comments are direct excerpts from that yet to be completed personal family book. Neil Postman wrote in his book, The Disappearance of Childhood, "Children are the living messengers we send to a time we will not see. The young are our legacy, a way of projecting something of ourselves and our times into the future." Let me share a little about my background. I was raised in a military family of 5 kids. My dad was in the Air Force and made it a career. We changed schools so much, I would say to my classmates, my father worked classified undercover missions. That's why we changed locations so much. That's true. It's not true about the undercovers. My sisters and I traveled to many parts of the country and the world. We've lived in New Jersey, New York, Texas, Hawaii, Taiwan, Japan, and the Philippines while growing up. Every year of my 4 years in high school, we changed locations. In the 9th grade, I was in Texas, the 10th grade in Taiwan, the 11th grade in the Philippines, and the 12th in upstate New York. Although my siblings and I benefited in many ways by seeing so many parts of the world, I yearned for a root, something that bound me in existence. As we traveled, no matter where we were or how tough things ever got, I always knew there was a better place, and that place was Ellicott City. The home of my grandparents. They were the center of great kindness and love. Ellicott City was always my directional beacon, my North Star. It offered a high degree of permanency for someone who was always in a state of transition as we traveled from location to location during the early years of my life. On those occasions when my father was on remote assignment, we lived here in Ellicott City for extended periods of time, and my grandparents' 930 square foot home with 1 bathroom. on old Ellicott City, old Columbia Pike. My grandparents, their 5 kids, my mom and her 5 kids, all 13 of us were sharing that 930 square foot space. I received a bit of "where are you from" in the course of my life. I would always say, "I'm from Ellicott City." The response would typically be, "Where is that?" Or still to this day, have they recovered from the floods? I have now lived in Ellicott City for almost 30 years, moving here from Columbia, where Linda and I lived for 15 years after I left active military service. I've spent 40 plus years of my work career supporting the U.S. Department of Defense and national security industry, continuing my travels to many parts of the world. We now have our 10th generation living in Howard County, with the birth of our 2-year-old granddaughter, Maren, along with her 7-year-old sister, Tessa. And our 5-year-old grandson, Aiden, shares a birthday with my grandfather, Ambrose. Aiden's there in the back. Hey, buddy. Back in October 2013, several months after my ordination to the diaconate of the Catholic Church, I casually mentioned to Archbishop Lori at an event that I had relatives who were baptized into the faith at St. Mary's Chapel on the Doughoregan Manor. It just so happened that he was invited by the Carrolls to hold a memorial mass for Charles Carroll. The Archbishop asked me to be his deacon at Mass. After Mass, during the reception, I had a lovely conversation with Camilla Carroll, the now owner of the manor and a direct descendant of Charles Carroll. I mentioned to her the story of my family and the connection with the Carrolls, and that my great-great-grandfather was a coachman for the governor, John Lee Carroll. She looked at me and metaphorically said, "Welcome home." It was one of the kindest things she could have ever said. I don't have a lot of stories passed down from my ancestors, but there are various stories about life in those periods of their lives that I would like to juxtapose against the times of their lives. I remember over 40 years ago attending my wife's Virginia Catholic High School class reunion. A young man approached me innocently and asked me how my family became Catholic, given I was the only black male in the group, and less than 4% of U.S. Catholics are African American. I knew why he was asking the question. Frankly, I really didn't have a clue. And guest had an answer and said, "We were brought in to the faith by missionaries." See what makes sense. That simple question inspired a passion in me to better know and cherish my roots. My family tree continues to be a work in progress. Thus far, it goes back to 1774. But we think we might be on the trail of uncovering another generation of my family. Right, Dan? Okay. Both my father and my mother's families were native Howard Countians. The focus of my talk today will be on my mother's side of the family. This represents over 40 families. Through the help of of a genealogist and a researcher I hired many years ago, and also through work at Maryland Archives and the work done with our societies here in the county, I traced part of my family roots. Now, there is a Members who own but 1 or 2 slaves, and maybe 100 acres of land. There were just a few families that owned the vast majority of slaves. In the 1700s, there were at least 4 prominent families that impacted the lives of my ancestors. They were the Dorseys, Warfields, Worthingtons, and Carrolls. My family members were connected to these families through slavery. And here's a list of the plantations and those family members that were a part of it. The Warfields owned the Oakdale and Cherry Grove plantations. As many of you know, Edwin Warfield became the 45th governor of Maryland. There were a number of Warfields owning slaves throughout the 4th district of Howard County. They worked 16 hours a day, 6 days a week on farms, for tending to crops and farm animals. And for the more fortunate ones, working in the big house, feeding infants, cooking, or doing house chores. My maternal grandmother, Gladys, was raised on parts of their property. Her parents came from the family of the Stantons and Freemans. My maternal grandfather's family were slaves of the Carrolls on the Doughoregan Manor and Folly Quarter. These were the families of the Addisons and Bransons. To date, Joe Addison is the oldest of my ancestors, born in 1774. We speculate he was born here 2 years before Charles Carroll signed the Declaration of Independence. By the 1700s, plantations were located throughout the upper Anne Arundel region, stretching from Elk Ridge to the Patuxent River. These plantations utilized enslaved African labor from the late 1600s until 1864, when slavery was abolished in the state of Maryland. Taking a look at the Martinet map of Howard County, the majority of my early ancestors were located in District 3 and 4 of the county. Hopefully you can see that. The Ellicott brothers built roads to Frederick, a local store, school buildings, railroads, and other such institutions, forming a healthy community along the banks of the Patuxent River. The Quakers, or the Society of Friends, were perhaps most active in demanding aid to Negroes in bondage. And as early as 1700, they were speaking out against the evil of slavery, insisting that Quakers free their slaves. Early dwellings were outbuildings, lofts, attics, storage spaces attached to the main house. And by the 1800s, separate slave houses on plantations were prominent, usually built by the enslaved who were well in those properties. These types of dwellings were common throughout the plantations of Anne Arundel and Howard County, and would also serve as the construction style for many black farmers long after the end of slavery. In Maryland, there was a ratio of 3 enslaved to every 1 free black person by 1800. the end of the importation of slaves in Maryland, and an increase in voluntary manumissions after the Revolutionary War led to an increase in the free black population in 1890. According to the 1860 census, there was more than 1 in 5 Howard County residents that was an enslaved person. Another 10% were free, double the proportion of the rest of the state. Although the 1984 Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves from the southern states, after the Civil War, Maryland was considered in the South. Each northern state enacted laws to grant freedom to their slaves. And the state of Maryland provided compensation to slaveholders for the release of their slaves. And this has been a good source of information for me and my family, because what we found is inventory records. And on those, or in those inventory records, they would identify the slave, their age, and their value. As you can see, on there, my 4X great-grandfather, Joe Addison, at the age of 60, was valued at $40. As I said earlier, Joe Addison to date is the oldest ancestor I've been able to trace. He was born in 1774 and represents my family's 250 years in this country. And he was a wheelwright. A little additional background on the Carrolls. The Carrolls originated from Ireland and came to the U.S. around 1688 under the family patriarch, Charles Carroll, the settler. He came to America in the wake of Cromwell's destruction of the great Catholic buildings and holdings in Ireland, finding a new world controlled by Protestants during the early centuries during the Reformation. The Carrolls' ability to thrive with their wealth was tough. There was a lot of destruction against Catholics and the Irish. It was the purchase of land by this Carroll settler in 1702 on the border of Baltimore and Anne Arundel counties that was later become the plantation called the Doughoregan. The manor was established in the early 18th century as the seat of Maryland's prominent Carroll family, home of Charles Carroll, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. It sits within 900 acres of Manor Lane in Howard County. Carroll of Carrollton is best known as the sole Roman Catholic and the wealthiest signer of the Declaration of Independence, and was the great-grandfather of John Carroll, who was the 37th governor of Maryland, and often referred to as the governor. And I speak to the Carrolls because so much of my family is tied to being slaves on the Carroll property. The Carrolls are often credited as one of the first families of the Republic. The Carrolls were known to be unyielding Catholics, and the settler is known to arrive in America to escape the hostile climate in England and Ireland against Catholics. But America was dominated by Protestants, creating numerous restrictions impeding their progress. At the time, Roman Catholics were barred from entering politics, practicing law. But again, the Carrolls had an unyielding devotion to the Catholic Church. I speak to, that unyielding bond to the church because each and just about every one of the slaves on their property were baptized into the Catholic Church. The first, and this, I don't want to suggest this is my family, but this is a family of servants and slaves on the Doughoregan Manor. The best and oldest family records we have been able to uncover and maintain was of my mother's maternal side of the family. And those date back to Joe and Kathleen Addison in 1774 and 1777, as well as Daniel and Nancy Branson. Their birth dates were 1787 and 1791, which predates by about 75 years the creation of Howard County. Research of my grandfather's family was aided greatly by the fact that they were last owned by the Carroll family. Joe Addison was a real wheelwright, as I said. Wheelwrights were important tradesmen in colonial times. They made wheels for wagons, carriages, and rolling chairs. Because colonial roads were rocky and rugged, wheels had to be made to handle the rough conditions. Wheelwrights also built or repaired carts, wheelbarrows, and wagons. So he was quite busy. Although skilled, Joe's value in 1834 was assessed at, as I mentioned earlier, at $40, while his son Moses, also a wheelwright, was valued at $50. My maternal ancestors were mostly Protestants. One of the few refuge slaves had was religion, which they flocked to in the various churches in the area. On my maternal grandmother's side, they were mostly Baptist and Methodist. Many of the earlier missionaries declared that slavery was contrary to the laws of God. However, the greatest direct impact on my faith were my descendants that were slaves of the Carrolls, as I mentioned earlier, the Addisons and the Bransons. Now, there is no evidence that the Carrolls encouraged conversion to the faith. Father John Ashton was a very active member on the plantation. The impact of Father Ashton's efforts were significant and worthy of note, as I represent the 8th generation of Catholics in my family since Joe Addison in 1774. It would appear that the Catholic faith didn't start on the cross side until about 1893 with David Cross's baptism at St. Mary's Chapel on the Doughoregan, obviously influenced by his spouse Georgiana, who was the witness at his baptism. The Catholic Church continues to be a family pillar on the cross side of the family. After non-Protestants began to worship more publicly, St. Paul's Catholic Church became the center of worship within the community. St. Paul's Church, Catholic Church, is a beautiful structure in and out. It has a remarkable history and has been a part of the legacy of Old Town Ellicott City since the beginning. The church building was established in 1835, but as we all know, the people are the church. It is a wonderful community of people representing different parts of the area. In the 1860s, the church provided hospital care in the basement for both Union and Confederate soldiers during the Civil War. Educated children since 1922, shelters the homeless during the annual cold weather shelter program, and homes individuals into the faith. It is the oldest Catholic parish between Baltimore and Pittsburgh. But often when I greet a new visitor, I'm asked, is this the place where Babe Ruth's wedding took place? I would say yes. October the 17th, 1914, to Miss Helen Woodford. I've learned to remember that day. Some years ago, I gave a homily, aka sermon, on servitude, and shared with the congregation that the irony was not lost on me, that as the product of enslaved people, I would be here giving a sermon on servitude, but a servitude to others through love. Now, as I have mentioned several times, I represent the 8th generation of Catholics in my family and the first ordained clergy of the church. And so that young man, 40 years ago, who asked me, how did I become a Catholic? Now I know. Moses Edison, we have not yet been able to uncover or locate much after 1834. But we continue to search for him. Caroline Addison is of note. She is one of over 100 grave sites located in St. Mary's Cemetery. St. Mary's Cemetery is a Catholic burial ground of about 3.2 acres, once associated with the Doughoregan Manor. It is now set, well, it's not, it always was, but now, with all the new housing, it sets in the middle of Turk Valley Overlook. Some of you might have seen some articles in the paper that speaks to this cemetery. And I was hoping Kelly would be here from the Parks, from Recreations and Parks, to give us an update, but she had a conflict. St. Mary's Cemetery is a Catholic burial ground, as I said, 3.2 acres. It likely contains many burials of once enslaved individuals. After emancipation in 1865, the Carrolls went to Ireland and recruited Irish help for the manor. And a number of these Irish servants are also buried in St. Mary's Cemetery. Church records held that St. Louis Church in Clarksville documented at least 163 individuals buried at St. Mary's, with at least 61 marked as colored. At one time, 48 tombstones with 51 names could be found, but currently only about 20, and all were Catholic. One of those colors was my third great-grandmother, Caroline Addison. The Catholic Church obtained ownership of the property from the Carrolls. However, in 1991, the church sold the cemetery to a developer who proposed building houses over the many objections of relatives and neighbors. So they were going to just clear out the area and build homes atop these burial sites. Howard County's state attorney could find no legal impediment to building the cemetery, bulldozing the cemetery. And the head of the county planning development office approved the developer's proposal for these homes. And of course, the first backhoe brought up human remains. So the county swapped a parcel of land with the developer for the cemetery. Howard County now owns St. Mary's Cemetery. And I must say, little has been done since. It's been a real work in progress. We've been advertising and every opportunity we get to post something in a magazine or a newsletter to really bring attention to this burial ground that's been abandoned and houses 100 plus souls. One of the comments I made to a reporter is, if burial grounds are sacred anywhere, why not here? And here's this tombstone of my 3X great-grandmother, a faithful colored servant to the Carroll family, was employed as a nurse in the family of the late Charles Carroll and of his son, ex-Governor John Lee Carroll. As I was going through my research, one of the things I did uncover is that Caroline left a considerable estate filed in June of 1894. After expenses were paid and one refund was deposited to the estate, the remaining balance of $1,207.08 was distributed to equal shares to 5 heirs, to include her great-great-grandmother, her daughter Georgiana, my great-great-grandmother, Georgiana Cross. I might not seem much today, but when you go back to the late 1800s, that was considered a rather large sum of money for someone who was enslaved. My 3X grandparents, the Greens, were located in District 4, that's around the Lisbon area in Western Maryland, Western Howard County. They were primarily farmers and housekeepers for the Warfields and the Dorseys in the area of Lisbon. John and Sarah are both identified as mulattoes, which means, of course, mixed race. Because of the proximity of Sarah Dorsey Freeman to the Dorsey household, it is likely she was related to a Dorsey. That's something we're still exploring. On a number of plantations, slaves weren't given last names and would eventually take on the last name of their slaveholder. I had once wondered where the 21% of my European DNA came from, and I suspect a good portion comes from John and Sarah Freeman. Lastly, Here is the deed of manumission dated August 17, 1855. So before slavery, for a number of different reasons, slaves would get released from bondage, but they needed to have basically a deed to prove that they were free, and this is called the deed of manumission. And this deed was given to Sarah Freeman. Now we're still trying to ascertain precisely whether this is Sarah, but all the dates really line up that the Eliza Dorsey and Eliza Freeman are the same individuals. Motto, same date of birth, same location. So there is a high probability that this is the same person. But this is a copy of her manumission that was provided by one of the Warfields. I believe it was Sarah Warfield. Yes, thank you. Okay. Says it there. The little I know of John Freeman is that he served as a private in the 29th Regiment of the U.S. Colored Infantry. Yes, there were a number of African American who fought in the Civil War. The 29th Regiment of the U.S. Colored Infantry was organized at Quincy, Illinois on the 24th of April, 1864, and ordered to Annapolis, Maryland on the 27th of May, 1864. The regiment was stationed in Petersburg, Virginia in 1864 and fought several battles, to include battles in Rio Grande, Texas, and also the siege of Petersburg, Battle of the Crater, and others. The regiment was at the same location where General Granger read the order on 19 June, freeing all slaves in Texas. The event known as Juneteenth, I think that's coming up soon. John Freeman was mustered out from Texas on November the 6th, 1864. Our county had relatively high enlistments from African American men during the war. Of the 400 enlisted into the United States Army, 70% were members of the 18th U.S. Colored Troop. A local African American, Decanter Dorsey, and I don't know if he's related to any of my Dorseys, received the Medal of Honor for his actions at the Battle of Crater. John Freeman established the start of the line of my family members who entered in the military, a line that went for 150 years. On that picture, all Howard County family members are there, with the exception of two. One is my father-in-law, who was killed in Vietnam, and my wife and I traveled to Vietnam back in March to commemorate the 55th year of his death, and that was a a real memorable experience. Also, my uncle-in-law, who served in the Marines, retiring as a sergeant major. But as you can see, many of my family members, including myself, I'm a retired officer from the Air Force Reserve. We all proudly serve. It's a legacy that thus far has stopped with me. So let me talk a little about the Stantons. Daisy, Maryland was founded in 1882 and is southeast of Lisbon, Maryland, off Route 144. Its crossroads are Daisy and Union Chapel roads. Louis and Sarah Stanton, my two ex-great-grandparents, migrated to Daisy and was married there May 16, 1889. There they worked on farms and in homes, primarily for the Warfields. The Daisy United Methodist Church was the anchor of the black community in Daisy. In 1876, black trustees, which included my great-grandfather, John Freeman, brought the land on which the church sits for $29.81. Segregation laws and lack of transportation limited African American participants in countrywide and statewide organizations. So the church became the location of religious, social, and political gatherings. In areas where public funding for African American education was limited or non-existent, churches also doubled as schools. This church continues to hold Sunday services, and one thing that I'm real proud of is they continue to have an annual Stanton Day in remembrance of the Stanton family. On the steep hill behind the church rests the cemetery where many of my great-grandparents and many other families lie and rest. I was here visiting it a couple weeks ago, and it's well kept. I wish I had a picture of it. As I mentioned earlier, David Cross was a coachman for the Carrolls. His family were slaves of Di Worthington. The Worthingtons are cited as early founders of the county. Di Worthington was chief judge from 1875 to 1879. And as I said, David Cross was Governor Carroll's coachman, driving him from the Doughoregan to downtown Ellicott City to catch the train. I think with 2 horses and a coach, it's probably about a 40-minute ride. One of the fondest stories my grandfather Ambrose would tell me was the times he would sit under the blanket while his grandbrother made the trip from the manor to the train station in downtown Ellicott City. I'm sure you guys got the stories too. I'm going to call. These are his 2 boarders sitting near my eyes. But I'm going to give her some help. An excerpt from my great-grandfather's obit reads, for over 65 years, a coachman for the Carroll family, reared as a slave by the Worthington family. David was the official coachman for the Governor John Lee Carroll. And I tell you, I must have read at least 5 obituaries of family members, and every last one of them cited that. You know, I'm the of David Cross. So it was obviously something of notoriety for the family. I don't have a lot of information on my paternal great-grandfather, Ambrose Sr. I know he was one of the first family members that migrated from working on a farm and plantation to having an industrial occupation. He was the first generation of Crosses to migrate to Ellicott City and was employed by the Baltimore transit station or system. My grandmother, Helena, moved from North Carolina and was a housekeeper. My great-grandparents, Fanny Stanton, we called her Mama Fanny, and John Henry Stanton, we called him Daddy Squirrel, was buried in Daisy on October 24th, 1910. In the 1800s, Harry and Fanny worked on many farms in the area of Lisbon, including the various Warfield properties with ex-slaves. With children in tow, Mama Fanny and Daddy Squirrel moved from Daisy to Ellicott City, where they owned their home on Merriman Street and farmed the land, raising hogs, chickens, rabbits, fruit, vegetables, selling their goods to markets in the area. You know, my aunts remember that well. I barely remember the little farm, but I did spend some time there. In the late years, Daddy Squirrel ended farming and became the county's first street cleaner. So he was up and down Main Street cleaning the streets. Some of my cherished childhood memories included the occasions when I would stay overnight with them, helping on their little farm. The family donated what is now known as the oldest structure on Ellicott City's Main Street, the Thomas Isaac Log Cabin. I don't know if they're still calling it that. There was an official ceremony on July 16th, 1988, attended by family members and county dignitaries. Now that cabin was located right next door to my great-grandmother's house on Merriman Street. And I used to pull the lawnmower out of there to cut the grass. So I do remember that structure. And every time I go down Main Street and see it there, it brings back those memories. So like I said, there was an official dedication. Liz Bobo was the county executive at the time, and James Clark attended, as well as numerous other county dignitaries. I was invited to speak, and on behalf of the family, it's a little snippet of my talk. The strength of this log cabin, as evidenced by its presence here today, represents the strength of my great-grandmother and so many like her who have endured the difficult years of our past through times of war, floods, national disunity, and economic hard time. I'll skip down. As a nation, we may not have the Acropolis, the Parthenons, the pyramids, or other ancient relics of the past, But those artifacts that we do have, we must hold dear and near. Let this cabin stand as another pillar of the foundation in which we build our future, and let this city prosper in the years ahead. So now I'd like to talk about my grandparents, and I say, without a doubt, the greatest generation. And I would say that of any parents or anyone who lived through those periods. My grandparents lived in old Ellicott City, or should I call it historic Ellicott City? I don't know what's politically correct. I still see signs that says old Ellicott City, so it's okay to say that, right? My grandparents lived in Ellicott City for most of their lives. In fact, my grandfather was born in the house on Old Columbia Pike Road. It was constructed in 1899. They were great patriots and showed it proudly, flying the flag in front of the house for all the years I can remember. They withstood the Great Depression and World War II, raising a family of 8, always showing a strong sense of pride. They really represent what Tom Brokaw called in his book, The Greatest Generation. When discussing Ellicott City, memories of the old Ellicott City business establishments come to mind. The Ellicott City movie theater was segregated for many years, and when it was integrated, my aunt shared that she went inside just to find out what made it so special. There were also memorable times visiting Paul's Market, which was a local produce market, Kaplan's department store, Yates, Towers, and Joe Berger's grocery store. Let me talk a little about my grandmother and conclude with my grandfather, who we affectionately called Daddy Sam. My grandmother, Mama Gladys, and that's my grandparents there, sorry. My grandmother, Mama Gladys, bestowed many gifts on us. She offered the gift of stability as she lived through so many tough times and always demonstrated such a strong sense of character. She raised and held the family together as my grandfather went off to war. She shared the gift of parenting, as over the years she was a secondary caretaker for many of us in the family. Me, some of my cousins there in the back. She shared the gift of parenting. She modeled the gift of hard work, as over the early years, she took in laundry and ironing to help make ends meet. For a number of years, she worked for Kaplan's department store. After having her third child, working outside of the house became difficult. She demonstrated the gift of sacrifice, as over the years, she and my grandfather would house parts of their extended family as we transitioned in life. 13 of us, a 930 square foot home. Mama Gladys was an extremely wise and gifted and knowledgeable person. For someone who rarely traveled outside the house, she was one of the most well-informed people around. She would discuss the latest issues on Capitol Hill. She could speak about the issues in Iraq, to the latest celebrity news. She really had a passion for current events. And I've seen that passion manifest itself throughout the family. I've never forgot her fantastic cooking, and particularly her pancakes, and her zeal to listening to WBAL, and religiously recording the holiday number, just in case the station called to ask. She was also a small business person working out of the house, taking and ironing to help defray family expenses. She gave us many gifts, but I personally feel her greatest gift of all was her gift of love. Her entire heart and soul was fully devoted to her family. And many of us can talk about external accomplishments. It has personally taken me a while to realize that there is no greater accomplishment. I can feel that happening. I got to it. Like I said, it took me a while to realize that there is no greater accomplishment in life than to have lived your life with unselfish devotion to the Lord, your family, and your friends. Mama Gladys lived that kind of life, and therefore has been one of the most successful people I've known. Although my grandfather spent the days working various odd jobs, it was my grandmother who was focused on raising 6 daughters, to include my big sister Debbie. My grandfather was my personal hero. There were many adjectives used to describe him. There are 2 that really stand out. One, he was a fixture of Howard County. 2, he was considered an institution. My grandfather went the extra mile, always working to bring in money to help support his family. I knew no one who worked this hard in so many different jobs as he did to help feed his family and provide a better life for his kids. Just to name a few of those jobs, he worked at the main post office, retiring in 1975 after 43 years. He was the first Fort County black postal worker, and when he retired, he had accrued 27 hours of sick leave. He also worked at Commercial and Farmers Market and at Lydig's Bakery, all on Main Street. At Lydig's, he cleaned and swept the floors and brought home day-old donuts that he received as a bonus. He was also a bartender for many parties and events throughout Ellicott City. He often had to shoulder the burden of being the first black at whatever he accomplished, whether that burden came the responsibility of being a credit to your race. And that, I must say, he accomplished with humility and grace. My grandfather also demonstrated the value of education. He first demonstrated this value, as history would have it, by finishing Ellicott City Elementary School through the 7th grade. Then he was forced to quit his education locally because Ellicott City had no high school for blacks. As a result, he picked up enough work to pay for transportation to Baltimore, where he entered and graduated from Old Western High School in Baltimore. Until 1950, many black students had to go out of the county to go to high school. In 1950, Harriet Tubman High School was built for black students. And in 1954, the Supreme Court ruled that it was legal to have separate schools for black children. It was not legal to have separate schools for black children. Howard County, along with other counties in Maryland, began desegregating its schools and sending children of all races to schools together. He also demonstrated the personal sacrifice to spend the money needed to give each of his daughters the opportunity to attend college. And through him, we had the first family member to go to college and graduate with a bachelor's degree. He was a real good role model and demonstrated the value of education. And I said he joined, he was a part of the Postal Service. In 1934, he took and passed the civil service exam and went to work for the U.S. Post Office. Now, almost 10 years later, in 1943, he was selected for military service. And as we celebrate yesterday the 80th anniversary of D-Day, here's an excerpt from my grandfather's memories of the war. After training, I was sent to Camp Shank, New York, where I was assigned for overseas duty. The first step was to Liverpool, England, and then on to Glasgow, Scotland. The company was returned to England for more training, and 6 days after D-Day, we were on our way to Southampton across the English Channel into Normandy. We were attached to the Second Army and the Red Ball Express, which supplied General Patton's tanks with gasoline and ammunition. I was promoted to sergeant and received a Good Conduct Medal, Certificate of Merit, American Theater Service Ribbon, World War II Victory Ribbon, European African Middle East Service Ribbon. He separated from the Army November 45. And at that time, he went back to work at the post office in the Vine. One of the war stories he shared with me was about this MP-44 machine gun. He indicated that a German soldier had his sights on him. But his platoon's leader spotted this soldier and took him out. I hope I'm not being too. Because of that, my grandfather received all the weaponry of this German soldier, and that MP-44 machine gun was part of that. Now, I did have possession of that machine gun. Brief story. My Aunt Teresa had passed it on to me. I said, I'm going to get this insured. So I went to a local gun dealer, and I said, hey, buddy, can you give me an assessment of what this would be worth? He looked at it, looked up at me, and he said, you know what you have? At my grandfather's World War II weapon that was given to him. And we had papers and everything, so we all looked at it. He said, "That's a machine gun. I can't give it back to you." Yeah. If I give it back to you, I could go to jail. So I said, "Hey, buddy, turn around." And I'll slip out the door, which I did, but along the way back home. So I get home. Fortunate or not, I told my wife. The next thing I knew, I was looking for a home, and I went to my uncle who had some friends at the police department. I said, "Let's donate it to Howard County Historical Society," which, we contacted Fred, and that was the plan. Well, that didn't work out. It's somewhere in the armory at Howard County Police Department. So, stories are for joining the past to the future, it was once said. Stories are for those late hours in the night when you can't remember how you got from where you were to where you are. Stories are for eternity. When memories are erased, when there's nothing to remember except the story. My grandfather, Ambrose Cross, was a deputy sheriff for his good friend John Bobbitt. He was a bailiff and was inducted into the American Police Hall of Fame. In 1992, the Howard County Council, at the behest of Judge Seibert and the other circuit court judges, unanimously approved a resolution authorizing the naming of the jury assembly room in the courthouse in honor of Daddy Sam, the Ambrose D. Court Jury Assembly Room. There are probably countless other jobs he held over the years. My grandfather died on December the 13th, 1991, at the age of 80, and was named in various articles for his humility and kindness. He was one of the oldest county employees. Here is a picture of him while Turk. He was honored with the Channel 13 salute tin back in 1989. One parishioner described him as the fabric of the community. Some of us receive honors for achieving accomplishments that bring great fortune and fame. He received the great accolades and honor for being a humble man with a kind and generous heart. I've got a little video. Let's see if I can get this started.
High Alumni Association focuses on the scholarship fund in the future. The class of 1952 already had Gospel Fest as part of its reunion celebration and plans to pick it in the near future. Ambrose Cross was a devoted county employee for nearly 2 decades, and his service at the county's courthouse was recently honored. Todd Johnson has more.
He was a fixture of the town, as important to some as the historic buildings that line the streets of Ellicott City, where he helped deliver the mail for 43 years. It said of Ambrose Cross that he could bring a smile to his family and to those he worked with. Recently, friends and former co-workers remembered Ambrose Cross by naming the jury assembly room in honor of the bailiff who worked for the county circuit court for 15 years.
All of us who knew Ambrose Cross will carry that in their hearts. The way that he was as a person, his niceness, his pleasantries, the fact that he dedicated himself to doing a good job, not only in doing a good job, and doing it in a way that everyone benefited from just being around him.
After retiring from postal service in 1975, Cross worked briefly as a sheriff's deputy before becoming a bailiff. At age 80, Cross was the oldest county employee. He passed away last December of heart failure. However, friends and family members will always remember his good management.
He was right in the thick of things, you know. He was greeting everyone, shaking everyone's hand, pressing flesh with everyone. He was just that kind of person. He was very gregarious, very kind, and just a very loving person.
What do you think you're going to do in today's ceremony?
He would have been ecstatic. He would have just loved it.
At the circuit court in Ellicott City, Todd Johnson for Howard Weekly.
Was that your sister?
Yes, that was my older sister, Debbie. I quoted my Angelo's in some of my sermons, but it really stands out to me. I've learned that people will forget what you said. People will forget what you did. But people will never forget how you made them feel. And just a couple, our family journey continues. Picture of the family with at my younger sister's wedding, and on the right, my family, my wife and I, 40th anniversary. And let me conclude with a comment my sister Debbie made in an oral interview that she gave. While evidence of Howard County's rural beginnings seem to be fading rapidly, the rural legacy is rich, its roots having flourished from a long ago era when life, although hard, seemed much easier, much simpler. My grandparents and their parents and their parents were the pioneers, hardworking, God-fearing, and determined to make good, decent, honest lives to themselves and their families. Against all odds, they prevailed, and I hold them up as role models, not only for African Americans, but also for all Americans. And their origins are right here in Howard County. Thank you.